Yeah, Shay, that's just fine. Yeah, I knew that up front. So just make sure you have the information for the quiz. So okay. So if you remember, when we're talking about early childhood, we're talking about around the age of 2 and on. And going back clear to the first of class, we talked about something called theory of mind. And theory of mind, if you remember, is that period of time when, in simple terms, we're able to look in a mirror and recognize that that is us, that we have our own unique human existence. And then what that continues to allow us to do is realize that if I have my own unique person, then other people have their own unique person. And this is when children start to be able to do what's called perspective taking. So let's say, let's take a before 2-year-old, above 2-year-old. If below 2-year-old, and again, there's a lot of variation in this. Under 2, if a baby is really happy but mom is crying, it confuses the baby, and the baby will mimic or copy that behavior of mom. So it'll stop laughing and begin to cry. Okay. After about the age of 2, we start to see children. Let's say a child is happy and they see mom sad. Instead of realizing that they need to change their emotions, or mom needs to change her emotions, they're more likely to wonder why it is that mom is sad. And this is when kids will go up to, and it's the cutest thing, seeing a 3-year-old and puts their hand on someone's back and say, "Are you okay?" or "What's wrong?" Right? This is when we start taking on that perspective taking, and we try to figure out what other people are experiencing independent of ourselves. Okay. Well, with that, we start to develop things like self-conscious emotions. We start to become wondering about whether what we're doing is good or bad compared to either everyone else. And if you remember, when we were talking about Erickson's theory, during this time period, children experience things like shame and guilt. Okay? Guilt being a child thinks about negative aspects of their actions. And this is linked to moral issues and such as hurting other people. Okay. And I'd like to kind of stop here right now, because if you remember what I've been saying about early childhood, the importance of early childhood is this is when we're going to develop many of our personality and our identity development, a kind of a self-concept of who we are. And that self-concept is going to guide us through our middle and adolescent years. And then it gets a little bit more complicated in adolescent years, because then we have peer influence. But this early childhood period is really when we can really start to develop a sense of self, a sense of, for example, my name is Curtis. It was given to me by my parents, but in early childhood, I gave the name Curtis some type of substance, some type of meaning, some type of place. Okay. And so it's that identity, the recognition of oneself, that really develops during this period. And I want to talk about moral issues, okay? Because this is very closely tied to our self-concept and our identity. And the example I would use is when we get older in life, when we get into old age, and individuals start to develop dementia and Alzheimer's, okay? we've looked at when does a person start to lose their sense of morality, knowing the difference between good and bad, aggression, when aggression is appropriate, not appropriate, and those kinds of things when it comes to dementia. Okay? And you would think it would deal with the areas of the brain that we deal with when we come up to any type of emotional, moral conundrum. We think it would be the amygdala area. It would be the hippocampus area. It would be the real front of your frontal cortex that would make you think, okay, that what is the moral ground in this issue? And interestingly, and this links back to early childhood, we start to lose a sense of morality when the neural tracks that are associated with our self-concept and our identities become destroyed. Meaning that our moral actions are very, very, very closely tied to who we think we are as an individual, and less to do with the fear areas or the cost risk areas of the brain, which is kind of an interesting thing. And this starts to develop in early childhood. Okay, and this is where we can develop things such as guilt and shame. And guilt, of course, being the concern about hurting others. The shame is about the attribution of bad behaviors and aspects of themselves, such as personal failures, like in school and sports. I'm not as good as so-and-so and the like, okay? And so what are some ways that that we can develop these kinds of things and representation of emotions, such as conversations with parents allow a child to understand and cope with emotions. You'll remember I talked about, especially in infants, that our first language is emotions. Okay, and infants are very attuned to emotions, but it's through the development of language that we start to connect meaning with those emotions. Okay, and we know that as young children who then become adults who are emotionally intelligent, which I'll get to here in a minute, tended to have parents who talk to those children about their emotions and about what they're experiencing, and providing them with the language to express those emotions. Okay? And this is when we see in early childhood the development of something called emotional intelligence. Okay. Now, if you've Googled emotional intelligence, you might get a mix of whether emotional intelligence is good in some occupations or others. And I will tell you that emotional intelligence is good in everything. It's good in business. It's good in leadership. If you read a article where it says, a CEO shouldn't have emotional intelligence, they should be cold and offish, stuff like that. That's not emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is not reactivity. And that's a lot of people who don't understand emotional intelligence think that someone with emotional intelligence is someone who's very reactive and emotional. Okay? I don't want you to think of it that way. Emotional intelligence is the ability to walk in the room, understand my emotional state, where I am emotionally, and then to read the room, as you would say, and understand everybody else's emotional state, and then have the ability to interact with those people in some type of socially appropriate, pro-social way to achieve some type of goal. Okay. We find that this develops in early childhood, first by starting with conversations with parents about how to define their emotions, give it a language. And then it's tested in the peer relationships and the sibling relationships when, little Bobby comes and takes my toy, right? What is the emotional expression that occurs? And this is where they're learning, oh, this emotion creates this in this person. This emotion in me, such as anger, makes me do this. Okay. Now it's not that on that cognitive level as we express as adults, but that's really what children are learning during this early childhood period. Now I will say, and this is important to say, emotional intelligence is not fixed. So if this is a skill that you don't have, it can be learned. It can be assessed and learned in adulthood very well. So just want to put that out there. So what are some things associated with emotions? One, we talked about the self-concept. How we think about about and describe ourselves is a large area for this period of development. They just developed a theory of mind, and so they're learning how to navigate their social world. Okay, we talked about initiative and guilt. This was the third stage of Erickson's psychosocial development theory, and how wondering about what my actions mean and what their impact are important. And this is also when we start the beginning of what's called our autobiographical memory. Okay, this is the most strong memory system we have as far as a long-term memory system. This is when we start to base our life on the story we create. Okay, this is where when someone asks, what were you doing when you were 4 or 5, and you come up with this story, oh, me and mom and dad lived in so and so, and I remember it being this way. And this in early childhood is when we start building that story of our life. And then another thing that starts to develop, because again, we're looking at our self-concept and we're saying, do I like who I am or do I not like who I am? And this is the development of self-esteem, okay? And we do know that young children tend to have a very high self-esteem. And it usually has to do with the inability to use things like social comparison when it comes to liking another person or not liking another person and comparing that to ourselves. Young children are just learning how to understand other people, but when it comes comparison of to the self, and that's usually where our self-esteem comes from, is we usually measure our self-esteem by comparing ourselves to people like us and people who we think we should be. And this is why young children tend to have a higher level of self-esteem. With that being said, if you do have children or you do interact with children who tend to say they don't like themselves, they don't really don't like who they are, those kinds of things, those are really red flags that there's something going on in that child's life on probably an abusive or a neglect level. So when you do come across a child who has low self-esteem, it's worth checking into and seeing what their home life is like and what's going on there, because that's a red flag for the potential of abuse or neglect. And whoops. Whoops, sorry about that. And then the other concept that we start to learn about in early childhood is self-control, or control over our own actions and our ability. And you probably heard of this famous study. It's been re-examined in recent years, but the Walter Mischel's marshmallow experiment. And what they were looking at is whether a child could delay gratification, whether they could admit enough self-control that they would then delay the gratification in the experiment. And what they did in this experiment, basically, in the most basic form, is that they presented a child with a marshmallow and said, I'm going to leave the room. If you don't eat the marshmallow by the time I get back, you'll get a second marshmallow. And the question is how many children will delay gratification, and what is the consequences of that ability to delay gratification? And what we found is that children who did delay gratification used several types of strategies, such as distracting themselves, twirling their chair around, singing a song, doing all kinds of things. So it wasn't this, they used some type of strategy to make it so that they could have that second marshmallow. And what they did find in the original study and the follow-ups is that preschoolers who had this regulatory were better able to regulate their emotions, had higher academic abilities in third grade, higher social competency in adolescence and adulthood. Okay. Now, there has been some criticisms to Mitchell's marshmallow experiments because there are social influences that actually predicted whether a child would be able to delay gratification or not. Okay. Mainly, it had to deal with family income and where the child was coming from. They found that children who were in poverty and were in low working class families were the ones who could not delay gratification, where it was children in the upper middle class and upper class that were able to delay gratification. And what is the reason behind that? And this is important to consider when we're looking at child and child development. If you think about a child who is in poverty, especially if they have more and more and more siblings, they tend to be competing for the next piece of bread. Okay, I remember I was raised in poverty. My family moved to 33 different places by the time I was the age of 6, and we never really had anything. And I remember that if there was food in front of you, you ate the food. And if there was something that was of value to you, you didn't just say, "Oh, I'll deal with that later." You dealt with it then and there, because there was a high probability that if you didn't do that then, that it wouldn't be there next time you wanted that thing. Okay, so it's not because the children were poor, it was because of the resources available to those children. It's not because they didn't have the cognitive skills to delay gratifications. It was because of their experience and their situation that made it so that they were unable to delay that gratification. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind, because these other things like higher academic ability in third grade and higher social competency also tend to be associated with social economic status. So that is the challenge to the Mischel's marshmallow experiment. What has happened since then, though, is things like Head Start, things like those have tried to put in programs to help young children from low-income families to learn how to delay gratification and all of those things, to some success on some areas and not so much in others. But I just wanted to bring this up that people prize the Mitchell's marshmallow because we prize not needing instant gratification, but there's a lot of social factors that play into the child's ability to do this. It's not because the child is somehow deficient or there's something wrong with them. And I just wanted to make that clear. The other thing that we start to identify in early childhood is gender. And specifically with gender, we start to learn about gender roles and stereotypes connected with being a boy or a girl. Okay. And we start to notice how people treat each other based on whether they're a boy or a girl. Okay. And so this is where really gender and gender type starts to play a role. Now, there were some famous studies by the Benns. They were a psychologist couple who were married, and they did raise their children in a completely gender neutral environment, meaning that even the books they read, they went through those books and basically whited out gender terms like he, she, and those kinds of things. They use gender neutral toys, and everything was gender neutral. And I think this is the power of social societies and stereotypes, is that these children didn't end up kind of doing what average children do, where they start going, ooh, girls have cooties, boys are yucky and gross. They didn't start going through that phase, but what they did end up doing is they ended up being kind of bullied because the boys, the young boys from the Ben family would try to go interact with girls, and they were confused when the girls would reject them. And the same thing with the Ben's girls. They would go and try and have fun and play boys' games, and the boys kind of shunned them out. Okay. And I'm not saying this to discourage anybody from trying to create a gender neutral environment for their children. I think to some extent that is healthy, but on the other side of it, we have to realize that the majority of children are raised with gender stereotypes, and we tend to, especially in childhood and stuff, kind of go with the rules of those stereotypes. Okay? And we see that theories of gender identity develop. They really happen in the three domains. The first one is the gender schema, and we've talked about schemas in this class before. And cognitive development, how, up until the age of about 23, boys and girls perform at different rates. Okay, so we see young girls being able to have verbal skills quicker, where boys tend to have math skills a little quicker. By the age of about 22 to 24, those differences tend to dissipate. But through this early area of development, we see cognitively girls and boys develop differently at different speeds. And then, of course, about behavior and social learning. Where do we learn the role of a boy and a girl? Okay, these three things in combination create our gender expectations and how I should act because I'm a boy, or I should act because I'm a girl. Okay. The interesting thing to me is in early childhood, if you were to dress to a boy and a girl exactly the same haircut, same everything, you can't tell the difference in whether they're a boy or girl, because children up to the age of 8 are actually androgynous. We tell the difference between little girls and little boys because of the way we socialize them, the way we dress them, and the like. So that's kind of an interesting thing when we connect this back to physical development, It's not really until we start to go puberty where we see physical traits differentiating between girls and boys. As I mentioned, young children start to go through moral development during this period. And we see, according to Piaget, there's kind of three developmental phases of moral development. The pre-moral phase is child can't consider issues on the basis of morality. They base whether they should do something based on pleasure or pain principles. What brings me pleasure, such as food, getting changed, being warmth, is a good thing. Things that are painful, such as hunger, cold, or overheated. Those kinds of things bring me pain, and so I work towards achieving the other end. Okay. Around the age of 2, again, when we develop that theory of mind and those kinds of things, we start to get what's called a heteronomous reasoning. This is when a child considers morality based on what's dictated by an authority figure, such as a caregiver or a parent. Okay? And during this period, and we're talking a period of about after the age of 2 up through about 5, 6 years of age, we get what's called imminent justice. This is unrelated events are automatically punishments for misdeeds. So if 2 events that are not supposed to occur together, those things need to be punished because there's some type of misdeed in them. Okay. And then the last stage in early childhood and then going into middle childhood is autonomous morality. And this is when a child is aware of the rules and what they need to adhere to maintain the interactions with others. Okay. Now, these are presented in perfection. Okay. What this theory suggests is that a child's morality is closely tied to whether or not they had basically the perfect home setting, the role models as adults, the opportunity to engage with others and authority figures and all of those things. And so moral development in childhood is widely diverse, is what I want to say. And to base a child's behaviors on this 3-stage theory would be kind of a mistake. This is kind of when this moral development theory is based on the optimal environment that a child could develop in. Okay. I want to talk a little bit, of course, when we talk about moral development, it is very much molded by the discipline we receive from our parents, caregivers, grandparents, and those individuals who we look towards as an authority type of figure. And we can divide parent discipline into 2 categories: positive discipline and negative discipline. Okay. When we have positive discipline, we work with the children using what's called inductive reasoning. Okay. Inductive reasoning is we help the child look at all of the pieces of a situation that led to their behavior and let them come to an understanding of the consequence of that behavior. Okay. So in this kind of situation, it's kind of like I'll try to come up with so in a child hits his brother or sister. So let's do this scenario. Little brother hits little sister because maybe they wanted to know what it feels like. Maybe the sister had a toy that the little boy wanted. The instant reaction in that situation would be to use some type of negative punishment. Negative punishment is when you do some type of power assertion in order to stop that behavior. So things like negative power assertion is yelling, spanking, grabbing, all of those types of things. Okay. It's really, and it also is when you withdraw love from a child. So this is when you say, you did that, I'm not talking to you right now. Those types of withdrawals of care and concern. In positive discipline, there are things though that you do, such as command strategies. When two children are hurting each other, there's things you put in place to kind of get the children separated. So you come up with, what if Billy hits Sally? What can I do with Billy in order to calm him down and then help Sally overcome what had happened to her? And then again, using the inductive discipline, how do I make it so both children understood what happened in that interaction? There's a great program on this. It's called Conscious Discipline. And it's where the parent is very aware of what's going on. They use where the child is developmentally to help the child understand their actions. And it provides some of these kind of command strategies and relationship maintenance strategies in order to help a child understand why they reacted the way they did, how they behaved. Okay. The issue with positive discipline, and to just be open and honest, is it takes consciousness on the parent's part, meaning that you have to put deliberate action into positive discipline. The other thing you have to do is let your emotions not dictate your action. Okay? For example, when we deal with spanking, most of the time parents don't spank to discipline. Parents spanked because it pissed them off. It made them angry. It made an emotional response in them that they then needed to alleviate through aggression. You know, I've heard all the time, you know, I was spanked and I turned out all right and all these, but I want to differentiate between positive discipline and negative discipline. Children that came from a positive discipline home are less likely to enter into high-risk behaviors. They're less likely to use drugs and alcohol. They tend to have healthier relationships in adulthood. They tend to have healthier relations in the workplace with their bosses and with their coworkers. Negative discipline actually, well, it may not have increased it, for example, the person who got spanked and they turned out okay, it still increased the probability that they would have ended up in the juvenile correction system, law enforcement system, poor relationships. And they tend to be the people who nag about their boss all the time. Okay, tend to. Again, there's diversity in human behavior. And I'll put it best this way. When I worked in the women's prison for quite a few years where I did therapy, I never met a single inmate that did not get some type of physical punishment, such as spanking, love withdrawal, those types of things. But I know of plenty of people who have never gone to prison, who never got spanked, never got hurt, never got that. So this is where this discipline issue comes into play. Is do you want to increase the probability that your child will take a bad road down the line, or do you want to decrease that probability and increase the chances of some positive things happening in your child's life? And that's really the choice a parent takes on when they decide between using negative punishment versus positive, negative discipline versus positive discipline. And the research in the scientific literature speaks to that very well. The other aspect is a parenting style. So what we just talked about is discipline. The other one is what type of parent is it even when a child is acting okay? What is the family dynamics? And Bauman put parenting on two continuums: how accepting and responsive a parent is versus how demanding and controlling a parent is. So if a parent is high in acceptance and high in demanding and control, they tend to be what we call authoritative parents. Okay, which means they put expectations on their child, but they also accept that the child has their own being and they should have say in what the family does. It's more of what another term that has been used is it's democratic parents. You set demands on the child. You say, we need to do these things. We need to act good. We need to have these type of morals. This is how we act in our culture, all of those types of things. But then they allow the child to explore those expectations. Okay? That's called authoritative parenting. When a parent is high demanding, but low in accepting and responsivity, this is what we call authoritarian type of parent. Authoritarian, if you want to think about this in political terms, this is a kind of a dictatorship. Okay? You do what I say or else. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. I am the parent. I am the adult. I know better, and you should just do what I say. That's an authoritarian speaking parent. Okay. The other two type of parenting is when you're high in acceptance but low in demand and control. This is called a permissive parent. This is when a parent does not place expectations on their child and they kind of accept them and let them be who they want to be. Okay. And I'll say the issue with this is what children are starving for are boundaries. And the issue with the permissive parent is they're not establishing boundaries. Children may not say they don't like being told what to do, but they actually do, believe it or not. They actually starve for it. And so in this permissive situation, you're not setting the boundaries for the child. You're just accepting them completely and let them behave the way they want to be and behave. In the last category, we have low acceptance, low demanding. This is a parent who just really, I'm going to say it, please excuse my language, doesn't really give a shit about the child and what they do. They really don't even want to be a parent in the first place. This is the individual who isn't acceptive and responsive to the child's actions and doesn't set any of those boundaries that that child needs. They're just completely despondent. If you want to think of this in terms of wrongdoing, this is the perfect scenario for a person, a parent who is neglectful, who neglects their child. Okay. Now, which type of parenting has the best outcomes for the child? Well, we have to give the gold star to authoritative parents, okay? Because they set boundaries for their child and they allow their child to explore those boundaries. And then when the child starts to exceed those boundaries, they work with the child to bring them back to the way that will keep them safe, will allow them to learn social skills, will allow them to be what you would call a responsible parent, a child in society, and eventually an adult. Okay, authoritarian parents. The issue with that we have measured with authoritarian parents is they tend to have the rebellious children in adolescence and into adulthood. Because the authoritarian parent is so controlling, Once that noose or that belt is loosened, the child then goes on to enter into things like high risk behaviors. They're more likely to, for example, have a teen pregnancy, experiment with drugs and alcohol and those kinds of things. And then when we look at the permissive and the disengaged parents, permissive parents tend to, the child tends to grow and develop without any, they tend to be that high risk seeker. They tend to not understand boundaries between people, so they'll get in people's spaces and take advantage of other people in ways. And the like, they don't grow that sense of community, as you would say. And the child who is raised in the disengaged family, as I said before, this is a child who will go kind of through those same symptoms and consequences of a child who is experiencing neglect, because that's actually what they are experiencing in their life with their parents. So these are the things that we have measured as far as type of parents. And I will say again, there is no perfect parent. We can strive to be authoritative, but once in a while, we might just say, you know what, enough is enough. Sometimes we're just saying, yes, just go have fun. We're being more permissive. Other times we're like, can someone else take care of the child for a while? And we become disengaged. The question becomes, when it comes to parenting, is what parenting style do we use most of the time to guide our philosophy about the development of our child? Because we're not perfect, but if we have a guiding principle for our family, we're more likely to adhere to that more healthy parenting style that has the most benefit for the child. The other thing we start to see in early childhood, especially when we get into the preschool and kindergarten years, is peer interaction, okay? And some of the things that we have to recognize that we've talked about is what is necessary. Remember, I've been pushing this in the class. One of the most important things we can have our children do in early childhood especially is engage in play. Physically, psychologically, and emotional. They need to take on those roles. Remember, they're developing their identity. They're developing their personality. And what is necessary for play? Well, we know things like impulse control, the ability to realize that sometimes I get to play with a toy and sometimes Billy gets to play with a toy. And the other thing we have to do is start to move beyond imitation. The child needs to start taking on their own behavior instead of following little Billy around and doing everything that little Billy does, okay? And so these are a lot of the things that a good high quality preschool tries to instill in children, is give children the opportunity to go and do that independent play and seek out their own interest. But they also implement things, impulse control include things like children who bite, who hit, who try to take control of situations. And a good high quality preschool really has good programs to implement that. And I would recommend, if you or someone who's putting their child into a preschool, these are the kind of things that you need to ask. Is what do you do when there's disruption in the classroom? What do you do when a child isn't able to, control themselves, so they bite or they hurt someone? How do you encourage a child to develop their sense of identity and sense of self? These are all good questions to ask when you're seeking out a high quality preschool or kindergarten or the like. Okay? And we also know, I've already mentioned the importance of play when it deals with development of the self, development with identity. But this is also when children are learning how to trust and have close relationships with other people besides their primary caregiver. Okay. And again, we know that from Erickson's model and attachment theory, if they develop that healthy attachment and that trust with the caregiver early in childhood, they're set up really good in early childhood to continue that type of style of attachment. But again, as I mentioned before, when we talked about Erickson and I talked about attachment, these things are not set. You can, if a child is having a tough time developing trusting and close relationships, you can use play as a way to develop that with the child, for the child. Okay, so again, I'm just bringing this importance up. The importance of play is one, it develops a sense of self. Two, it's a very good learning opportunity on how to develop trust and closeness in relationships, especially for children who didn't have that attachment ability in early childhood. I do want to just spend a moment talking about play disruption. Play disruption is when a child has the inability to play because of their own emotional state. And it prevents them from a kind of free expression linked with fun of play. Okay? This can happen when a child, again, is high in temperament, so they're very emotionally reactive. It can come from a child who doesn't have a healthy attachment from infancy, and all of these types of things. The importance of picking this up when a child just says, I can't do this anymore, or they get instantly frustrated, is again going back to this positive discipline. It's bringing the child back to a state of understanding what they're experiencing. Going back to the beginning of this presentation, where the importance of this period of type is being able to put labels to the child's emotions and behaviors and how those two things are connected. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. So if you see that with a child, you want to really bring up helping them label what they're experiencing, connecting their emotion and behavior. And the best way to do that is through play. Skip this for now. Okay. I am going to stop recording. Maybe